Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. We are honored to have Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris on the show. I don't know if our audience really needs an introduction from you, but maybe a brief little intro of who you are and some of your work here.
Sure, yeah. I'm Robin Carhart-Harris. I'm head up the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. We've been doing brain imaging research with psychedelics for quite a few years now, and more recently depression research and anorexia research, um, and I'm off to California in August, which is
I heard
exciting.
that's exciting.
Yeah, so a lot going on.
Are you going to be attached to Imperial College still, or are you kind of leaving that position?
I hope to be attached to Imperial for a little while. I've got an honorary position with them, a visiting professorship, which is nice, and so I'll stay close with my good long term colleagues David Nutt and David Arizzo and the gang at Imperial, which is nice. So I won't entirely be severing that strong, emotional bond as much as anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Excited to come to California?
Oh yeah, very excited. And the weather's actually the sun's just come out, but it's awful in the UK, so a part of it as well. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, not to disappoint you, but San Francisco can be a little foggy also. But I'm sure you'll have more nice days than in the UK.
Yeah, but I hear some tips about living in the East Bay and this kind of thing. So
Yeah, my brother lives
uh,
over there. It is a little bit warmer on that side for sure. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I think we're all really excited to be talking to you. You have such legendary work. I've always since those brain scans came out of psilocybin and LSD and those images of how different our brains look while we're under the influence of psychedelics versus just normal everyday has been such a big, I think, influence for a lot of folks in the community. And I thought that could be a cool place to start, right? Talking a little bit, just explaining briefly your pretty pivotal theories on the entropic brain and the REBUS model and how psychedelics work in the brain, if you don't mind.
sure, yeah, happy to. Do you know the entropic brain idea? Um, it was like a smudgy abstract thing in my head for a little while, and I was inspired by a human neuroscientist, Carl Friston. Actually he's sort of generally considered, well, he's the most cited neuroscientist in the world, so he does pretty well. And I've been influenced by his ideas and work for quite a good while. And so he was schooled in physics, and I I guess an early inspiration was the findings that we had when we looked in the brain on psilocybin, and we saw these drops in blood flow in regions of the brain that are ordinarily very highly perfused, meaning they get a lot of blood flow. And so then I was chatting in the cafe at Imperial with a friend of mine, and I was saying it's like an entropic kind of displacement, somewhere where there's sort of disproportionate amount of blood. It's now maybe a more sort of equal spread, and it's just a playful idea. And he'd said, the entropic brain. That was a chap called Robert Leach, so I should credit him for the initial term. And actually, he's an author on the entropic brain paper, and I made sure that I had a little acknowledgement at the end that he'd come up with a term. But what happened after that was, I don't know, it was intuition really. I started buying books on like a dummy's guide to entropy, and and I read a couple of these books, and they were saying fundamentally entropy is uncertainty. And sure, it can be applied in thermodynamics, which is where it was initially applied, but most fundamentally, you could call it a dimensionless measure of our uncertainty about something in the universe, a system, phenomenon. and I took inspiration from that. And I, early on was the sort of natural idea of an increase in entropy, an increase in uncertainty. The most familiar translation of entropy is probably disorder. And so there was this intuitive idea of in a sense, a disordered brain. I know there's more to the story, in terms of the phenomenology or the lived experience of a psychedelic experience. But disorder goes some way there. And so that was part of the early intuition. And then it was just like, look, if we're going to look in the brain, I bet we see disorder. That was almost it, really. And then over time, it's become more formalized. And we do indeed see that, the brain activity becomes less ordered, more unpredictable. So we're more uncertain about it when we come in and sample it. And then there's this, question of, okay, let's try and firm up our definitions here. What should it map onto in terms of the quality of consciousness, of conscious experience? A disordered brain or an increase in the entropy of spontaneous brain activity. And there, the sort of updated theory was, it might translate into the richness of conscious experience. And that's more or less where it's been parked since I wrote on it in 2018, I think. I published on a sort of revised or revisited entropic brain. And the rebus thing, you might say, is a sort of natural, um, logical sort of next step, which again takes inspiration from Carl Fristen's work, and particularly, I suppose, how he was inspired by the so-called Bayesian brain model of how the brain works, which, put simply, says the brain is a prediction machine. Put another way, it says the brain becomes a model of the environment it exists in, and it functions to predict that environment and also motivate behaviors that can help steady the experience of that environment, or active inference, that we move around in a way that we kind of know how things are going to be when we move around in that environment. And it's a great model of living beings because it explains how we do what we do, and other animals and organisms do what they do, and they behave in a way that works for their niche. And maybe what's one of the things, because there's a few things that's especially weird about humans, is that one is that we exist in so many different environments on the planet. Um, I don't really think that there's any other specific organism, short of like bacteria, that can live in so many extremes. So we're very adaptable, and I think we can model quite a lot of the environment. Therefore, because we can live as Eskimos in the Arctic, and we can, be in the desert just about getting by. And so, yeah, but anyway, the rebus model says, okay, so if we start with this principle that the brain is a prediction machine, and it develops to predict the world, and that gives us a sense of assuredness and mastery in our environments, then what psychedelics do is that they drop all our assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're like we could be a fish or another animal, and everything is up for grabs, and hence things like ego dissolution can be explained by that model. If the ego is a model, all encompassing model of who we are, who we think we are, based on our experiences, the stories we tell, more actually the stories we tell, and the stories others tell, than our experiences, actually, in a curious way. Because when the ego drops away under a psychedelic, experiences that were maybe buried can percolate up. And yeah, in the words of someone like Jack Cornfield, who would say, that's not who we are, that's not who we are. or in the context of a psychedelic, that's who we really are, when the stuff comes up. And so it's I think it's quite an appealing model for explaining quite a lot, especially the dropping away of stuff like the ego, like our industrious analytical minds that go hand in hand with the ego. And then the next bit, which is what's the positive to the negative, or what comes in when assumptions drop away, is in a sense the next piece of the puzzle. Um, and yeah, some hypotheses are entertained in the rebus model, and the fact that it says rebus and the anarchic brain is somewhat a kind of glance in the direction of what might happen when information percolates up. Ego drops away, assumptions drop away, and then stuff can percolate up like emotion and memory. Like in a system without a top-down governor, like an anarchic system, you get interesting sort of emergent phenomena. Yeah. So that's kind of where things are right now, I would say, in terms of those models.
It's so interesting. And yeah, I guess like when I was reading it and learning about it, made sense to my own experiences when, yeah, like we talk about things bubbling up or the insights and the downloads, and it's like, oh, well, it was starting to make sense. It's really fascinating model, and just like, just really appreciate this work because, yeah, it's starting to put some puzzle pieces together, right? And there's this
Yeah.
idea that this state like create some more like flexible state in the brain, right? And I've heard you use so many different terms for this, like it becomes a catalyst of change. There's a window of opportunity, and that's kind of how it relates back to how psychedelics can help with mental health conditions like depression, maybe anorexia. That's a really interesting one I'd love to ask you about.
Mhm.
So can we talk about this, like, this benefits of this flexible brain state and like what you mean by a window of opportunity and how does that help with mental health?
Yeah. So, increasingly now, thinking about mental illness, I suppose, with the recent publication of our most recent depression trial, thinking about depression, but also thinking about, anorexia and other indications that psychedelic therapy could be useful for. A natural place to take your mind is, why do we fall ill? Um, and why might there be a lot of overlap between different psychiatric disorders? I guess the simple way to say it is, um, why do they happen? And it's not the honest thing to say is that if like and if academic psychiatry is to be honest with itself, it would say it hasn't answered that question very well at all, because popular ideas that have dominated academic psychiatry for a long time have involved things like a neurochemical explanation for it, or efforts at a genetic explanation, and this kind of quest to um, biomedicalize the phenomenon has, I think, led to not a dead end, but somewhat of a dead end. What they call Me Too drugs, which all more or less do the same thing. Antidepressant drugs, new ones will come out, but they're not really different than the previous ones, and they're typically, with the exception of ketamine coming on the scene, they're drugs that you take every day, and they decrease symptom severity, but they don't do that much more, really. And they don't do that much more than placebo as well. So drugs aren't very good, and clinicians recognize that, and patients recognize that. And and I think it's come about because of a failure to answer that question: why do we fall
Mm.
ill?
Yeah.
And you hear from someone like Gabor Mate, and he speaks so humanly about mental illness, and he would say, why the pain, not necessarily why the addiction, but why the pain, and that's beautiful. And I think these days, when you're looking at the evidence is saying, well, genetics. I think I read somewhere, um, the genome, the genome has never read the DSM. And just to break it down, like, genes, they don't relate to diagnostic categories in any way, really.
No.
And what you find when you look at, say, depression, anxiety disorders, anorexia, OCD, um, addictions, the genetic contribution is shared. There are certain genes that seem to predict those disorders to some extent, and it's a collection of genes. Um, but they predict them all. There's no specificity. And so it's just basically saying vulnerability to mental illness. But that's vulnerability. And actually, vulnerability might be sensitivity to stuff. It doesn't all have to be one way. Oh, you're orchid, they call it. Orchids versus dandelions. Orchids are really sensitive, and dandelions will survive anywhere. Um, and so this idea that I know it's binary and simplifying things, but it's just to help people try and understand that some people are especially sensitive, and genetics confer that sensitivity. But the evidence, as far as I can, see it, and what makes sense to me, and increasingly so, is that the environment plays the
Mm.
larger role, and whether we could call that adversity in the context of mental illness, trauma, complex trauma. The thing with trauma is we often think our trauma is specific trauma, and in PTSD the mapping's really natural and explicit, and that's PTSD. But often the nature of the trauma can be abstract. It can be more prolonged than a specific event. But
Mm-hmm.
essentially, it's the same thing. It's like you've suffered psychological injury, emotional injury. And I would say, if in hopefully the near future, academic psychiatry and beyond mental health research can acknowledge that people are often unwell because they're injured in some way, then the
Yeah.
whole tables are turned, and caregivers know what they're seeing when patient comes to them, and they're more willing to listen, I think. And so, yeah, I'm not quite sure how we got there, but to say that a lot of mental illness, psychiatric disorder, whatever you want to call it, in a sense, is the inverse of plasticity. What happens when you're injured is, you know, um, well, you sort of defend, or if you think of an infection, you defend, and these defensive forces have to come up now to fight a pathogen, and it's somewhat similar. And there's this term borrowed from evolutionary science, which is called canalization, which, if you think of the analogy of a canal, canals only go in one direction, they're built, and then you're going this way. And canalization means resistance to change. So, if plasticity, most broadly defined and simply defined, is the sensitivity to being shaped, then canalization is the resistance to being shaped. I'm depressed, whatever's going on in the world, I'm not hearing it, and I'm not hearing myself. I can't access my past in a way with any specificity. I can't connect with other people. I'm cut off from the world. If it's an addiction, it's all one way, this object of relief. When's the next relief coming? And it's similar, whether it's specific obsessions in OCD, or compulsions, or a certain hang up in an image disorder like body dysmorphic disorder. So there's the problem. And I'd like to think, and I was inspired again recently by reading about germ theory and how it revolutionized healthcare in the 20th century, and like life expectancy was massively prolonged because people knew that you caught these infectious diseases through little particles, germs or sure, viruses aren't germs, but the general idea of small pathogenic agents. And so once people realized the origin of why people were ill in that sense, they could find solutions. And COVID's an example. It didn't take us long at all to realize the nature of why people were ill. And then, remarkably quickly, despite how devastating the disorder was, we found the solutions, the vaccines. And if in mental illness there is a shift to a consensual view about the role of adversity on top of vulnerability, but adversity is the thing that's been overlooked, you might say, the role of environment, then I'd like to think that the treatments can be more effective in the future.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. There was actually a paper that I just read that came out within the past 2 years, kind of exploring germ theory, but then with mental health disorders and stating, you can't really find anything in the body that's really mediating this mental health crisis or illness. And one thing that they mentioned was maybe instead of medical interventions, we really need social interventions,
Yeah,
because it's how we're adapting to our environment, adversity,
yeah,
etc.
yeah.
And it's just really interesting to hear you bring this up. And I wonder, being a neuroscientist, really studying the brain and thinking about mental health issues stemming from the brain, like how are you starting to view this? Like, it sounds like, it's not all in the brain to some extent, as you're saying.
Yeah, it never was, because if the brain is fundamentally a model of its environment, then you can't understand the brain without understanding the environment and the context that it exists in. So I think any human neuroscientist needs to be in equal measure a psychologist. And I suppose that's something that I've just tried to do naturally, because both sides of the coin I've found equally interesting and valid. I think you lose part of the picture if you're looking at either one too much and dismissing the brain, or dismissing, psychological and psychosocial influences. So we might have read the same paper. But
Probably.
Probably, yeah.
Simon Hagen is the one that I read. I've got it sat next to me because it's often in my mind at the moment. Um, yeah, that would be one implication, that if you're just going to come in and tackle the biological, then you're missing the actual picture, and it can only ever be an incomplete solution. So, I mean, the great promise and maybe paradigm shift of some sorts with psychedelic therapy, at least in the developed world, and modern medicine, would be that this treatment is a combination treatment, is fundamentally a biopsychosocial treatment that says the most effective way to deliver this treatment is with a therapist and psychological support, and the utilization of community and integration as well. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, it's so interesting when you were talking about social interventions. Like, I kept thinking, like, are psychedelics both a social, maybe, and a biological intervention? And that's just where you ended. So, like, it's really interesting, right? And how these kind of conditions that we're talking about, depression, OCD, addiction, they're really kind of like a state of a really rigid way of thinking, where we're just like really struggle to get out of these like just kind of controlling like paths in our minds in a way. And that when psychedelics open us up to these new ways of thinking, it can help us moving forward, right? Especially in the medical container. But I guess I also always think about, there's some new research coming out about psychedelics for neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And I think a lot of people who aren't scientists are starting to refer to this. They're like, oh, well, I microdose every day because it's like regrowing my brain cells. And I'm often really skeptical, because I'm like, are we sure? Like, how does this work? And how is this related to like the mind and the state of emotional, how we just interact with the world and our social environment? And I guess while we had you, I'd like you to just talk to us a little bit about, like, you know, there is this study that psychedelics, what's it called? The structural and functional, what was that study called? Connectivity, the structural and functional connectivity of psychedelics. And they did find that there is, you know, something going on there with neurogenesis or neuroplasticity. But I did want to ask you, like, you know, what is going on with the brain in terms of like regrowing brain cells, or and what does neuroplasticity really mean for mental health?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be useful for people to understand that plasticity in and of itself isn't an intrinsically healing force. There's this phrase of the plasticity paradox or the plastic paradox. Um, where did I find it? Norman Doidge has written a wonderful book on plasticity, and he cites it there. It might even be his term. Um, so you can increase plasticity, and let's come back to that kind of orchid analogy. You're driving, in a sense, like orchidicity, you're driving sensitivity, and that's great if you come into it and you are full of positive expectation about, let's imagine that microdosing is what you're doing, positive expectation about this microdosing, and your buddies are doing it, and life's not too bad, you've got a job and a partner, whatever. And so this is a good mix, and you're an orchid in this pretty positive, enriched environment, and you do well. But throw that plasticity into a period of turmoil in someone's life and hard socioeconomic conditions, and events happen that like the tragedies that can sometimes sideswipe us. And is this good that this person's microdosing through this? And um, yeah, that's a very reasonable question, and it's similar themes around things like, what if psychedelic therapy is re-traumatizing, and it can be. So things can come up. You've created this flexibility such that old wounds can be opened up, and if there isn't the right support, is someone actually going backwards, and you've kind of had what they call a iatrogenic outcome, a worsening of someone's condition. So, plasticity has become such a buzz term that everyone's thinking that's the solution. That's the solution to the extent that we can have psychoplastogens, or whatever you want to call them, and no therapy, psychedelics without the psychedelic effect.
Hmm.
I'll believe it when I see it in human beings, but and there may be a way of doing it, like low level plasticity that could be therapeutically useful, but I do believe it would have to be twinned with um, contextual manipulation in a positive way. Somewhat like how SSRIs and CBT seem to be a bit better than either in combination. Maybe microdosing and quality psychotherapy could be a lot better, than either in combination. There might be a synergistic interaction there, because you get more openness and plasticity with a psychedelic than you get something useful for psychotherapy through a SSRI. So that would be my hope for those efforts to try and, in a way, strip in maybe some of the more intense, like colorful subjective effects from psychedelic treatments. Would be okay, if you're going to do this, maybe think very carefully about what kind of psychotherapeutic adjunct you would bring in with that approach.
Really interesting to think about. So, as you're speaking, I was just reflecting on an experience I had when I was 20, I think. That was kind of traumatizing, psychedelic experience. And let's say, I had this experience in neuroplasticity, creating new neural pathways, opening up to maybe new ways of seeing. And it just never felt like it ended. And I know Michelle here had some questions about HPPD. But, that was an experience where it felt like it opened me up. I had this new way of seeing the world in some sense, and it just kind of never ended for about like 3 to 4 months. And it was actually really scary. And to really try to work through that without much of a framework, it was actually, there was a lot of regret I was going through. I was like, why did I do that? Which made me kind of fearful for a bit about exploring these states here and there. I was able to resolve it, but for about like a year or so, really trying to explore that. So just thinking about like the negative aspects there of like being maybe too open and maybe creating those new neural pathways. You're like, oh yeah, okay, I can see all this stuff now, and okay, how do you shut it off after you've seen it?
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge.
No, it's so interesting. And we wanted to ask you, I guess, or something I was thinking related to this is like, could there be risks of like going into an entropic state too often, right? Like, do you want your brain to be so chaotic, more than a few times a year or something like that? And I guess also like piggybacking on this idea that Kyle just had, like, what do you think of HPPD? Like, this idea that folks have these lasting visual distortions, most likely after LSD, sometimes this like depersonalization that causes like a lot of depression, especially like I've done a little reporting on it. It's like often in teenagers, which makes me think maybe they're like a bit too young, their brains are still quite malleable, and then they're going into these chaotic states. I wonder if you have any thoughts or any plans to do any research around this.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic that a few people are picking up on now. Academics in this space, they sometimes refer to, well, not just academics, people refer to it as the dark side,
Yeah.
academic of psychedelics, and um, yeah, there's a few interesting phenomena, and HPPD is one. Those reports of enduring. It's often the perceptual effects that are enduring, but then uh, yeah, as maybe a sense that there's some residue of the experience that's not subsiding. Is that kind of what you were referring to, Carl, with personal experience?
Yeah. It just felt like it never was ending, and it felt like something was just continuing. And actually, I know that you were kind of introduced to psychedelics through the work of Stan Groff, and that was I picked up LSD Dora to the Numinous, which I think was a reprint of the book that you stumbled across, Realms of the Human Unconscious. But in there, he was saying something more from, I guess, this depth-oriented approach of, this non-specific amplifier bringing the unconscious to the surface. And he was saying he was observing sometimes people getting stuck in these experiences for days or weeks. And I don't know if he made the analogy of like a record. Maybe this is how I was interpreting it. But the unconscious coming to the surface, and if you're not creating that container to process it, the record continues to spin in the unconscious, and that's why you're having these kind of prolonged effects. And he said, we would just dose people even more. So I took that into consideration, and I did that about like when I felt comfortable, like a year, 2 years later. And a lot of breath work helped out too, but it helped to resolve something that felt like it was turning.
Right,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. Yeah, the analogy, and it's really just an analogy in the same way that maybe the entropic brain started as a kind of analogy of sorts, is of like a heavy mass, like a black hole or a planet or something, or a sun, a star, and things orbit around it, and maybe if there's some kind of in the Groffian model, you would call it a system of condensed experience. I think he calls it a coex system,
Yeah.
and it's like a heavy mass that has gravitational pull, and so if under certain conditions, maybe you're sort of orbiting this mass and going around and around it, and the mass, maybe it's like the mass needs to be digested, um, and you're close to it, but you're not close enough to understand it and break it down and digest it. And maybe you can see this after trips, but you can also see it during, when people's minds start looping,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
it's almost like they're gravitating towards something important, like a breakthrough. Um, Maybe it's a really painful realization, and they get close, but then they get stuck in the orbit, and then they, I don't know, have some kind of decoy-like distraction about the music being annoying or something.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? But it's only on the kind of analogy level. It just feels like, underneath it all, there probably is something mechanistic, if it matters to get at, where we could sort of see dynamics in the brain that look like a kind of looping, and then looping around something. And yeah,
Yeah, I remember when I was chatting with Dr. Torsten Passy, he was kind of brought up the idea of traumas kind of emerging, and he kind of believed there, wasn't really anything going on in the brain with HPPD, but mostly maybe it was a traumatic trigger that was like kind of got activated. Um,
yeah, and PTSD, when the trauma is explicit, and you kind of know where you are with PTSD, and it sort of helps in that regard. With other disorders, you don't, the origin is a little bit more abstract, and
yeah.
um, but I tend to think that depressions, eating disorders, addictions, and evidence would back this up, often involve some kind of trauma or complex trauma. Um, and Yeah, and then, in PTSD you have the recurring, thoughts and images, the flashbacks, um, and yeah, and then similarly, you have a defensive response, which might be like a dissociation. And so a depression might be sometimes a different flavor of that. Maybe the thing that could be pressing is, I don't know, some repressed anger would be the Freudian model. It's some like discerting object, and yeah, and then instead of the actual anger erupting, it gets turned on the self, in this hateful, self-loathing way. Um, but Yeah.
No, no, thank you for going into that. It's really interesting. I really enjoying this conversation thinking about kind of like, the brain and the mind, and they are different things, right? And like psychology and neuroscience, very different. But it's psychedelics, we also kind of have like the spirit, or there's like also, I feel like a third element. There's like a little bit more than just the brain and the mind. Then there's all these like transpersonal and kind of like extra human experiences. And I guess I just wonder, as a neuroscientist, like, yeah, how do you even think about, how do you even start processing like these transpersonal experiences, or when people, people start to like have a little bit of like telepathy or entity encounters and this kind of thing. Like, how do you even start to think about that, or do you in like a scientific way?
Yeah. Well, I'm of the view that you've got to, because people are saying it, so it's part of the space. And um, but I would say it's the interpretation that might be the difference. So, whereas to say the telepathy thing, it might be so perceived telepathy, or what do you actually mean by telepathy? Is it the sort of implicit understanding of somebody else's mind, or is it an apparent coincidence happens and you think that's just so uncanny that it has to be something beyond our understanding of any psychological mechanisms, which I would tend to sort of favor a psychological explanation for things like telepathy, and certainly entity encounters. And so one thing to offer here would be to say, so it's all real, in the sense that it's all stuff people experience. Um, and another thing to say is, what's real and what's fantasy or imagination is not a clear cut thing when we're dealing with the unconscious. Um, what is a memory, and what's sort of constructed in a sort of fantasy kind of way is not a clear cut thing, and memory can become fantasy, and then images like entities can be one sort of feeling from them, and then just flip and become. It went from a monstrous archetype to a maternal one or an angelic one, in a moment. Um, and so I guess the question in a way would be, are you willing to treat all of this as nature, meaning nature in the sense of the whole of the universe, and if there are multiverses, that too. So just stuff that, you know, whatever curious, uh, the chain of events we're sitting in as conscious living beings, but it's the universe. Or do you sign up to an idea that somehow there's something transcendent of that
Mm.
universe? Now, my view is to go with the former, um, because I don't know where to start with the latter, and I would be bolder still to say I don't think anyone else really knows where to start, apart from what you might call pseudoscience, which isn't actually really science, as in there are hypotheses that have no evidence. So that's okay if it stops at hypothesis, but if you start claiming or clawing from some other aspects of actual science to try and spin a yarn about some transcendence of this nature, so some supernatural explanation for things, then I just think that's an abuse of science. And it's often curiously tied up with an anti-science position,
Mm.
which bugs me as well. It's like, kind of, and people might often say, I'm not a scientist, but,
Yeah.
there are these quantum forces that, and you're like, yeah, if I want to know about these quantum forces, I might, ask a, a quantum physicist about them, but you ask a very credible quantum physicist like what's his name, Carlos Rovelli, is it? And deeply fascinating stuff about the weirdness of the universe. Deeply fascinating and weird, but I don't see any supernaturalism there at all. I just see wonder at
Yeah.
the universe that we exist in.
Yeah. Something that's been helpful for me in this topic, just thinking, have you ever read any of Alfred North Whitehead?
No.
No. Our teacher Lenny always pushes it on us, but Whitehead has this idea of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, and that's been kind of helpful for me when I think about like entity encounters, where that experience is kind of real, but it's not concrete. Right, you can't bring that into like this 3D dimension, but Whitehead talks about all these possibilities that ever could that came before us, and, maybe kind of gets into these different dimension type of things. But yeah, that's always been helpful because those experiences are very real for people, right? They impact you, and it definitely creates a change. But is it concrete? Can you pull it into this
Mm,
reality?
mm,
And maybe that's what's going on, is that we take this kind of experience and try to make it this abstraction into something that's
yes,
concrete.
yes, yes. That meaning making quest, and if we were in a different, or maybe it's not a different domain, but let's just say the domain of like spiritual practice, meditation, then maybe a wise, teacher might say something along the lines of, "Let it be uncertain." You don't need to hurry an explanation here. Sit with the uncertainty, explore it. Uh, and I think maybe that would be good advice in the psychedelic space, because sometimes there can be an eagerness to explain, and that can create explanations that are really tenuous, and rather than just to say fascinating, mysterious, but that you don't have to concretize it. And the classic one maybe is the DMT
I was
experience,
just
where it's
thinking that,
so
yeah.
far out that
Yeah.
you're just thinking, what the hell was that? How how does that happen? where do I start? And it's so compelling that the natural thing to think is, I did leave. I went somewhere else. It's another place. And then all the ideas to try and fill in about this other place. And I get the sort of compelling sort of drive in that direction, and why we would want to move in that direction. But um, I just think it's an interesting one, just to let it sit there and think. Um, I mean, I'm biased as a psychologist, so I would go to what could be offered to explain this in a psychological way, in terms of what entities are so pervasive in terms of our experiences, particularly as human beings, and these entities that are experienced are often entities with some kind of sentience. Um, not always, but generally. So there's a degree of sort of theory of mind there, like they know that you're there and you know that they're there, and that's a human experience. Even if they're alien-like beings, it's still a human-like, quality of consciousness. And mostly the first thing that happens when we're born into the world is we're met by an entity of some sort. Maybe it's a nurse, or um, yeah, and so and the eyes, it's usually two eyes, or two eyes and a million eyes. But the eyes, the gaze, and how that is, particularly human phenomenon. And so while it's weird and alien, does it have to be alien in a concrete sense? Um, and another thing is, we're hammering a system that maybe there aren't many other ways in which one can really, or maybe there isn't, if we're going to be bold about it, another way to hammer the brain in that way within a lifetime, really. So it's a very kind of unusual, like alien thing to do to the brain, to slam in, onto 2A receptors, a big rush of agonist, and even death,
Mm.
is death like a DMT trip? I mean, it's probably like a trip, but is it like a DMT trip like that? Um, maybe that might be the only thing that could come close. Yeah.
We chatted, I don't know, probably like 2 years ago at this point, but I think I remember sharing my story. I had a near-death experience, and the first time I experienced psilocybin, there was a similarity between the two for me that felt that's like what got me super interested in all this research was, whoa, what's going on here? How could I ingest a substance that grows from the earth that reminded me so much of my near-death experience?
Mm.
And it was just so fascinating, and to some degree, I say, well, I was primed for that, right? I mean, I was really processing this experience for years, and coming from that framework of that inner healing intelligence, inner radar from Groff. Well, maybe I just needed to process that, and that was a catalyst to shoot me back into that experience. But yeah, it was very eerily similar, and I was like, what is going on here? So I don't know. I always like to play around with it a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't think I would. Who knows? But my guess would be to say that it wasn't all priming. Priming could have played a role in terms of the interpretation, and the familiarity. But I would say that the physiology is likely similar. When we are in a dying process, it makes a lot of sense from what I've read and understood, that the brain would move in a psychedelic kind of direction. Um, uh, yeah, yeah, and the most reliable way to whoosh out the serotonin 2A receptors natural agonist serotonin is with some extreme stress. It's true that you whoosh out a ton of other stuff as well, so the specificity is kind of lost.
Yeah.
But and yeah, Yeah.
What do you think about like Strassman's hypothesis? I know David Nichols kind of gave a talk at Break-In Conventions a few years ago, kind of arguing against the DMT hypothesis in near-death experiences. What are some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I'll keep an open mind about it and treat it as an empirical question. I think the evidence is a bit mixed. There's some since Dave Nichols' critique, there's been a bit more research in the direction of suggesting, oh, maybe DMT release during the dying process is of a sufficient concentration to activate the 2A receptors. Um, yeah, in a way that might be like a psychedelic dose. And so it becomes that kind of question. But then there are other questions about, well, what about serotonin itself? Is it DMT doing it, or is it serotonin, or is it a combination of both? And it might, yeah, if I was to make a wild guess, because we can do that, you know, in forums like this, I think I would say it might be a combination of both. And I do imagine the 2A receptor and signaling at it, happens during the dying process that contributes to a quality of consciousness that is is basically psychedelic. Yeah.
Fascinating. No, thank you so much for going into that. It's so cool. I really appreciate it. I guess I thought we'd spend like our last 10-ish minutes. I do want to ask you a little bit, more about you and your plans for the future. I also wanted to ask you, you're a pretty famous figure in the psychedelic movement, right? I mean, like, for a scientist, I guess, like, it's kind of hard to imagine scientists can even get so famous somehow. Like, it's like rock stars, movie stars. But, like, I guess I was wondering, like, do you ever feel pressure? I mean, is it hard? Like, what's it like being a celebrity scientist in the psychedelic movement?
uh, well, I try not to think about it too
Sorry.
much, but I get no, I get a lot of offers to do things. Is like a real world kind of concrete thing, and so finding the time for that and not letting it distract from core business. So like prioritizing seems really important. Um, yeah, not to get carried away with it. I know when the New England Journal of Medicine article was coming along, I knew that there was going to be another spike, and that's happened in the past, and I got caught up in it,
Mm.
as it inevitably um, dies away. I remember it happening once with one of our papers. In fact, the first LSD brain imaging research and the psilocybin treatment-resistant depression paper all happened at once, and it was this big spike in interest. I got caught up in that, and then as it died away, I don't know if it was dying away, and I thought, where's the attention? But there was, I had a period of lowness, like a depressive episode, and it was
Mm.
something odd there. And so as this, more recent spike was coming along with the New England Journal of Medicine article, I was sort of ready for it, and in a way ready maybe to try not to get too caught up in it. And so far, so good, I would say. It's kind of like take it or leave it. Stuff happens and then it goes, and then you crack on. And actually, I don't love it. It's a lot of ambivalence about it, because it's quite nice, and then it's also, you could do without it a lot of the time as well. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, and not, it's an odd thing as well because I'm not an entertainer. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just really interested in a certain topic, and it just so happens that a lot of other people are now, and we sort of share this interest. So it's fun on that level, and the longer it can stay just fun and play. And actually moving to UCSF and Neuroscape, I feel really good about it because Adam Ghazali, who founded Neuroscape, is that kind of character, and we're often saying, oh, we're going to have so much fun. And it feels like that. And that's how I
Nice.
want to be doing the work, when you get caught up in anything that's not that, then it goes awry. But luckily at Imperial, most of the time, and certainly in our team in the centre, that's how it is. We're often saying, "Oh, we're so lucky," and it's fun. And our meetings every week, I think the others would say, they're fun, and the time flies, and they're really immersive, and we go off on tangents, and so yeah. But it's yeah, I don't know. I guess if you're an artist, let's say you're a musician or an actor, you would love to think that they're doing it for similar reasons. They're just into it, and it's an expression. I suppose it's different, isn't it? It's an expression. It's an outlet. Anyway,
No, I
yeah, a
appreciate it.
bit different.
It's so human. No, I just think you have like a lot of fans. So I just imagine, I don't know. I know it can be a lot of pressure, just like being sort of public too. It's a weird thing sometimes. So just appreciate you
Yeah,
going into it a little.
yeah. I mean, it's a funny old thing. I mean, as a psychologist, you can look at the psychology of that. What is that? What is that projection? When you become a sort of fan of someone, it's like projecting all these positive qualities that may well not
Right, that I
exist.
probably don't have, right? Interesting. No, I do want to ask you about your upcoming work at Neuroscape. Like Neuroscape's this really interesting lab at University of San Francisco where they do a lot of like virtual reality and like video game, like therapy and advanced neuroimaging. And to like mix that with your expertise in psychedelics, like to me is super fascinating. And I like can't wait to see what comes out of it. So I guess like what are your plans? Do you have any first studies lined up or, what's going to happen?
Yeah, we're slowly developing a protocol, and there's a lot of input coming in. I've been a bit distracted, so I've been able to give it too much time, and also formally, I'm Imperial still until July the 1st, so I had to be kind of true to my main employer or only employer at
Yeah.
the but yeah, it'll be, but of course we're thinking about it, and so we have this kind of three study program with a deep dive on contextual factors, and then also, how not just to detect them, but also to stimulate with context. So, novel uses of of contextual manipulation, I suppose, historically has been music mostly, but let's be creative. A shaman might blow a puff of flower water into someone's face at a given point, or adaptively change their Icaro, rather than just playing a set playlist. So it's not so far from stuff that has a long heritage. It's just a sort of modern variety of it potentially. And Adam's been very good at sort of, in a sense, testing my flexibility on that, because I was like, oh look, we've got it down, we know how to do it. You organize the playlist, you close your eyes, two guys, um, and then he's like, really, does everyone do that? And then you realize, oh, actually, this was a Western phenomenon that's been around not for that long, and maybe there are other ways of doing it. So that's healthy, is taking someone who doesn't, hasn't been a psychedelic researcher in Adam, bringing a freshness and his expertise to things. And so, yeah, deep dive on a few topics like context and also the substates within a psychedelic state. That was always a sort of crude way of talking about how psychedelics work in the brain, that it's one state and you can have the neurocorrelates to the psychedelic state. But what about, the looping and the struggle
Yeah.
states, and then the bliss states, the oneness states? So, in the future, if we can start drilling down into those kind of questions, it could be really good.
That's so interesting. I can't wait. I think it's going to be, yeah, really looking forward to that. It's going to be really exciting. Yeah, one of the last things I wanted to ask you is related. So, the Psychedelic Neuroscape Division is partially funded by Compass Pathways, and so is some of your work at Imperial, right? And I guess I wonder what you think of some of the psychedelic community pushback against Compass, that they're trying to, monopolize psychedelic therapy rather than maybe try to support like a more full legalization. Do you have any thoughts? Do you ever feel conflicted about it?
Yeah, a bit ambivalent, or trying to not get sucked into any black and white thinking on it. And I think there might be a bit of that, and it's all going one way as well. And I guess the recent events were sort of sparked off by something that Tim Ferriss had said, but he wasn't pointing at Compass specifically, but it got pointed in that direction. He was sort of saying, I'm uneasy about the land grab that's going on
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
commercialization of psychedelics. I think it would be healthy if people want to attack patenting, um, which I don't like patenting. There might be exceptions where it's justified, but the idea of patenting psilocybin therapy and monopolizing that, if you want me to be clear and transparent about it, doesn't have my support. And then, but a question would be: is that what Compass are really doing? Do they believe that they're going to do that? I don't know. Um, I don't know. I'll just park that one there. To be accurate, so actually, the funding into Neuroscape is philanthropic from George and Katya. That sure they're founders of Compass, but it's their personal money coming in
Mm.
philanthropically. So that's important to say. And also Compass money into this. There hasn't actually been any funding from Compass into the centre research. Uh, yeah, we all our research is investigator led and supported by philanthropic donations. So that's important. I
No,
think there
thank you.
might have been some misinformation on social media or
No, it's
something. But
important to clarify that. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Yeah, I
yeah.
guess we could just like end. I mean, I guess one of the fun ways to end, I thought, like, what do you want to see for the future? Like, if money was no object, like, is there a study you would love to do, or I don't know. How do you want to end this? What can we expect from you?
Oh, there you're coming back to just wanting to have fun, and in a sense I don't want to get too canalized, with some project, and it is fun working collaboratively with others, and I like that others are picking up the baton and driving novel areas. Like just one example, Leo Roseman in our team looking at conflict resolution in collaboration with MAPS. It's a big collaboration, and Palestinians and Israelis working on this project around the conflict in that part of the world, and this observational study of people drinking ayahuasca together. That's going to be published, we think, in about a week, and so I love that kind of people taking the initiative and driving interesting areas, all sorts of things. Sam Gandhi looking at nature connectedness through our research, and so it's really healthy. I think that richness and a rising tide lifting all boats is what I hope for. I very much hope for that, and I hope it's a healthy community, and it's a community and there's cohesion. And so, you know, just coming back and somewhat this coming from the previous topic, I would hate to see any kind of fractioning of this
Yeah.
space and
All of
talk of
us.
turf wars and that kind of. I don't, I think we need to think about what we're doing now. If there are sharp elbows and genuine, you know, goings on that are about cornering a space and exploiting a space, and then I think it's healthy that it be called out actually. So yeah, I just hope for it. If the realization that you get from psychedelics is we're all in this together,
Yeah.
then wherever we take this direction, if we do it like we're all in this together, then that's what I hope for.
Likewise.
Same.
Agreed. Yeah. Awesome. Well, it looks like we're at time, so we know that you're a busy person, so we want to respect your time. Anything that you want to close with, or shout outs to any social channels for people to follow you on or websites?
Oh, that's a nice opportunity for thanking the philanthropic donors into our centre. Initial ones like Shamil Chandaria and Tim Ferriss. Um, yeah, and anyone who's put in philanthropically into this space, because there's a lot of commercial money coming in and huge amounts. But the philanthropy floats pure inquiry, pure science, where you're doing it because you're just curious, and you want to look here and you want to look there, and you're not driven by any other agenda other than curiosity. So a shout out to that kind of generosity that has moved this space more than anything else. Yeah.
Awesome. And you're
awesome. Well, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. Well, sorry, what were you going to say?
Just that
there,
Robin's pretty active on Twitter, right? People can find you on Twitter if they want to follow you on social media. What's your handle up there?
Which I don't know, maybe R. Carhart or something like that. But put in Robin Carhart-Harris and it comes up. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Robin. I've been wanting to interview for like 2 years. This has been such an honor. I really appreciate your time. This is a super fun conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me.